you cannot operationalize the world and organize the world or any form, participate even in the world, through a theory of control. Because in a theory of control, or a theory of transactions even, let's just root it there, you create externalities, unintended externalities in the relationship. And in that process of optimizing and entangle a relationship to myself versus yourself, I create a shadow of externalities. In that process of optimizing to myself, I create asymmetric power. And in the act of creating asymmetric power, I reinforce the need for transactionality. But in that process of transactionality in shadow, I rarefy myself, but in the process I actually become more and more objectifiable and objectify the world. So there's this vicious cycle rooted in our theory of transactions, and the rooting of that theory of transactions is rooted in the theory of the contract. I'm really boring. Our theory of the private contract as the means of organizing the economy has been a contract manifestation of an objectified world. So now that requires, in that asymmetry, you construct the theory of assets, of property, of labor. So the more asymmetric we become, we create a more objectified contractual relationship with the world around us, and that amplifies the violence in the system. Now, the interesting is that violence has been self-terminating, us to use people like Daniel Schmachtenberger's language. And whilst many people focus on the existential or sort of what I call super technologies, carbon sequestration, XYZ, or even tree canopies, obviously we're working on. But the problem is not the technologies of building trees. We know how to do that. The problem is the worldviews and the deep matter codes that are rooted in those systems. So how do we move away from a theory of contracting rooted in transactions to a theory of relationship rooted in care? Now, and this is derived from conversation with Forrest, and I want to fully acknowledge that most of what I say is standing on the shoulders of many other incredible giants of thought. But what I appreciate is that when you move to so if we move, firstly, we're moving out of a theory of objectification and asymmetric power and what I'd call the passivization of agents into objects, but recognizing the inherent agency of the world around us, step one, then trying to move into some form of relationship which isn't about dominion and control, you have to move to a theory of care. Now, I don't mean care as a sort of caring for something, but in care with something. And I think the language frame is important. So to be in care, though, requires three simultaneous computational processes. One, and again, just keep referencing Forrest, I think this is derived from Forrest's thinking, so I think it's really important to reference. To embody care, I have to spatially, temporally recognize myself. This is derived, so any mistakes are my own. And then, in order to embody care, I have to be able to situate myself through your lens, or the lens of I don't want to use the other, but I don't have the
second person.
Second person. And then I have to simultaneously operation myself to the indivisible. You and I are non-divisible. Mm-hmm. So the first person, the second person, and the non-divisible. Mm-hmm. And that's when you construct the theory of care. Now that theory of care then starts to build a new theory of governance, which is no longer extrinsically driven, but intrinsically driven at the form of the relationship. So we've shifted our theory of governance being an imposed violence control system, but to being actually a relational system. And so whilst they are super technologies, macro technologies, I think the technological shift that we're looking at is rooted in the agent into re-embodification of agency, as well as shifting the relationship between things. And that is rooted in reimagining myself as one, a multitude, two, a multitude that is a function of my interrelationships, and three, a multitude that's a function of my relationships in fundamental development, which is why the language I keep using is we are into becomings, not into beings, but into becomings. And to embrace that plurality, fractal plurality, becomes really vital in actually a different way of operating. So I've taken the language down into what I'd call the deep code of the system, which requires transformation. And then we get into a really interesting question, and this is where I don't know. So I get that at what I would say a human-to-human level, or a sort of three-dimensional computational capacity, as we've discussed, at the human-to-human level. Now, how do we do that within human and silicon level? Is it even possible? People like Forrest would say it's not possible because carbon-silicon substrates will never create empathy. I don't know. I'm going to leave that open. I'm going to leave it open for discussion and exploration. But I think what's really interesting is an entangled world. We are going to have to bridge into a landscape of synthetic, certainly some landscape of synthetic embodification and some form of spatial compute, which has some form of relational capacity to care. So if I was, one of the big pleas that I think I would love to drive research on right now is technologies rooted in a technology of care. So what is the contract of care? What are the new technologies that embodify and accelerate relationships of care? And at that moment in time, that's a deep code that drives systemic transformation at every level. That changes theory of contract, that changes theory of money transactions, changes all of our currency discourse, which I think is really poor and driven by, my big in the society, my big frustration right now has been that the Web3 landscape, which should have been about entangled value, became about fractional value. It became not only about fractional value, it became about hyper-transactification of everything, rather than actually new theories of value that opened out outside theories of transaction. It became about new central bank plays, decentralized only at the level of the chain itself.
And grift.
As opposed to actually distributing the capacity to radically produce money in a different way, in a claim, how you create claims on the future. And I think the key word is who has the power to make claims on the future. And if you can democratize the capacity to make claims of the future, that's a much deeper thing than the central bank that's now privatized. And whereas those technologies were really open to what I would say entangled value functions, new transactional landscapes rooted not in transactions but in care, and a new democratization of who has the power to make claims of the future, and what is the mechanism of creating accountability to make claims of the future, which is, I think, what the theory of money is in many ways, bringing claims to the future.